On a summer evening in 1822 in the rural heart of Alabama, a small community gathered for what should have been a night of joy. Candles flickered in a clapboard church, their wax pooling in silence as guests whispered with excitement, waiting for the appearance of the young bride. Outside, the air was heavy with magnolia and damp earth, and the sound of cicadas filled the gaps between hushed laughter and faint strains of fiddle music. She was said to be beautiful, dark hair pinned with ivory combs, a dress of pale silk carried across the ocean, a girl whose life until then had been marked only by quiet duty and the expectations of her family. Tonight was meant to be her transformation from daughter to wife, from girlhood into the fragile promise of adulthood. But when the moment came, when the doors were to open and her steps were meant to echo down the aisle, the bride was gone. What began as confusion quickly hardened into dread. Guests searched the small church, then the yard, then the trees beyond. Lanterns bobbed like restless fireflies across the grounds, voices calling her name until they broke into frightened silence. She had vanished not into another room, not into the forest for a breath of air, but into something larger, darker, and far less forgiving. In time, the story of the vanished bride would grow into more than just a missing persons case. It became a legend, stitched with superstition, whispered in kitchens and passed from neighbor to neighbor, until it took on the quality of a haunting. Some said she had been taken by forces beyond the living, stolen as payment for an old sin. Others swore she had run away, escaping a marriage she did not want, her disappearance planned with meticulous care. And yet no trace of her was ever found, no footprints in the mud, no scraps of fabric caught on thorns, no body in the shallows of the nearby river. Only silence, a silence that outlasted every theory. To understand her disappearance is to understand the world she lived in. Alabama in 1822 was a place in transition where the frontier was pushing outward, where communities were being built out of swamps and pine forests, and where the lines between faith and folklore blurred with every generation. People lived with constant reminders of mortality, sickness, childbirth, hunger, accidents. Death was never far, and so the veil between the living and the dead felt thinner. Stories of spirits, curses, and omens did not feel like inventions. They were explanations, a way to put shape to the chaos that shadowed daily life. The bride's family, proud and pious, insisted that she had been taken by something unholy. Her disappearance was too sudden, too complete to be anything else. Yet beneath their grief lay whispers they tried to suppress, that she had been restless before the wedding, that her letters revealed a hesitation she dared not speak aloud, that she had gazed too long at the woods behind the house, as if imagining a path no one else could see. The community itself fractured under the weight of her absence. Some accused the groom, whose stiff silence and clenched jaw only added to suspicion. Others muttered about her family, about debts unpaid, about sins that might demand retribution. In a time when neighbors knew every detail of one another's lives, her vanishing tore open anxieties that lay just beneath the surface, fears of betrayal, fears of curses, fears of a justice that belonged not to courts, but to older, more merciless powers. As the nights wore on, the church where she was last seen became a place avoided after dark. Guests who had been there swore they could still hear the rustle of silk in the empty aisle, the faint impression of footsteps that never reached the altar. And in the years that followed, some claimed to see her figure in the moonlight, walking the edge of the woods, her veil drifting like mist, her eyes searching for something forever lost. The Vanished Bride is more than a story of a missing woman. It is a story of how fear shapes memory, of how grief transforms into folklore. It is about the silence left behind when answers never arrive, and about the way a single night can cast a shadow across generations. In Alabama's long, complicated history, filled with violence, faith, and survival, her story became a touchstone, a reminder that even in the most joyous of moments, the ground beneath us can give way, and what we hold most dearly can slip into darkness. Tonight, we return to that silence, to the flickering candlelight and the music that never reached its crescendo. We return to the mystery of the bride who vanished on her wedding night, a mystery that lingers not only in history, but in the way the living continue to speak her name in whispers. To understand the disappearance of the bride in 1822, we have to look beyond the single night of her vanishing and into the deeper landscape of Alabama itself in the early 19th century. The United States was still a young country then, not even 50 years removed from the Revolution. The region of Alabama was newer still, carved out of native land and stitched into the Union as a state in 1819, just 3 years before the events we now recall. It was a land unsettled in more ways than one, a place of opportunity for some, of displacement and despair for others, and always a place where survival balanced on a narrow edge. Life in Alabama during that time meant living on the frontier. Settlements were scattered, many still little more than clearings hacked out of the dense pine forests, or small farms edging onto river valleys. The rivers themselves, like the Alabama, the Tombigbee, and the Black Warrior, were lifelines, carrying people, timber, and cotton from isolated homesteads toward larger towns and, eventually, to the markets of New Orleans. Roads were poor, often muddy tracks barely navigable by wagon, so communities remained somewhat insular. News traveled slowly, and when it arrived, it carried with it both wonder and fear, for the wider world often seemed stranger than the one at hand. In 1822, Alabama was rapidly transforming into the Cotton Kingdom. The soil was fertile, and settlers, many of them migrants from the Carolinas, Georgia and Virginia, came seeking wealth in cotton cultivation. With them came enslaved laborers whose forced work made the crop profitable. Plantations began to rise in the river valleys, their owners building ambitious houses and imagining dynasties that would last generations. Yet alongside these wealthy estates were countless small farmers and tenant families living in rough cabins, eking out an existence with corn, hogs, and gardens. The gulf between the two worlds was wide, and yet in towns and churches, they mingled uneasily, bound together by necessity and by the fragile promise of community. Religion held a powerful grip on life. The early 19th century was swept by what historians call the Second Great Awakening, a wave of evangelical fervor that spread across the frontier, carried by itinerant preachers who held camp meetings in fields and forests. In Alabama, these revivals drew hundreds, even thousands, to hear fiery sermons, to weep, to shout, and to pledge themselves to a faith that promised salvation in the face of the wilderness's dangers. Churches sprang up quickly, small wooden structures with plain interiors, but they served as more than houses of worship. They were centers of social life, gathering points for scattered families, and places where news was shared, disputes settled, and rituals of birth, marriage, and death sanctified. The bride who vanished on her wedding night belonged to such a world. Her family likely measured its wealth not in luxury, but in respectability, owning land, attending church faithfully, keeping to the expected roles of their class and gender. A wedding in this context was not only a personal union, but also a public event, a binding of families, a sign of stability in a region where stability was rare. Marriage was, in many ways, survival. It meant labor shared, children born, land worked, and futures secured. But woven into this backdrop of faith and family was a darker undercurrent. Alabama in 1822 was haunted by violence against the land's original inhabitants, the Muskogee Creek people, who were being forced from their territories. Violence in the form of duels between men over honor, violence in the hidden cruelty of slavery. Communities bore these tensions quietly, but they surfaced in strange ways, in ghost stories, in whispered fears of curses, in the kind of folklore that made the disappearance of a bride not merely a tragedy, but something that felt like a reckoning. Medicine, too, was rudimentary. Illness could strike without warning, and doctors had limited tools to fight it. Fevers, childbirth complications, infections all could take a life in hours or days. This ever-present threat of sudden death gave a certain shape to the imagination. When a young woman disappeared without trace, the lack of explanation invited not only earthly suspicion, but also supernatural speculation. It was easier, perhaps, to believe she had been taken by spirits or by fate than to confront the possibility of human cruelty or unbearable grief. Social customs were strict, particularly for women. A young bride in Alabama in 1822 was expected to embody modesty, obedience, and virtue. Her wedding dress, often hand-sewn, was both a garment and a symbol, a sign that she was stepping into her prescribed role with grace. Yet beneath this facade of order, many women bore silent struggles. Marriage could be an arrangement of families rather than a choice of the heart. Love was not always guaranteed, and the weight of expectation could be crushing. For some, the wedding day was not a dream fulfilled, but a threshold into a life they feared. The vanished bride, if she felt such fears, would not have spoken them aloud. Society left little space for dissent. The land itself added to the mystery. Alabama was and remains lush, humid, and heavy with atmosphere. The forest seemed endless, filled with shadows and sounds that could turn sinister in the dark. Swamps stretched like hidden worlds, their waters deep and their edges treacherous. To vanish in such a landscape was frighteningly easy. A slip, an accident, a predator, or simply the labyrinth of the woods could erase a person without a trace. Yet in 1822, people believed that the land held more than natural dangers. Spirits were thought to inhabit the rivers and trees, and the wilderness itself was often personified as a force sometimes generous, sometimes vengeful. Newspapers of the time were small but influential, and while rural Alabama did not yet have many presses, news of strange events traveled through word of mouth, letters, and traveling merchants. Stories grew in the retelling, and the bride's disappearance, once whispered within her church community, likely carried outward, gaining layers of interpretation with each passing year. Some accounts might have emphasized romance, others divine punishment, others simple misfortune. The lack of answers allowed the story to be molded by the needs and fears of those who carried it forward. So the disappearance of a bride in 1822 cannot be seen only as the loss of one young woman. It must be seen against the tapestry of a frontier state still finding its identity, a place where wealth and poverty lived side by side, where faith collided with folklore, where death was always near, and where women's lives were often written for them by others. It was a society both fragile and fierce, capable of building communities out of wilderness, yet also capable of turning suspicion and fear into enduring legend. The vanished bride belongs to that world. To understand her fate, we must walk into the Alabama of her time, where every joy carried a shadow, where every celebration was also an invocation against loss, and where the silence of a missing bride would echo far longer than the vows she never spoke. The wedding day dawned with the kind of brightness that promised celebration. In a small settlement not far from the Alabama River, neighbors awoke early, hitching wagons and donning their best clothes to witness the union of two young people whose families had long shared ties of land and church. The air was thick with late spring humidity, carrying the scent of pine resin and blooming dogwood. In such a world, a wedding was no small affair. It was a rare chance for joy, a temporary reprieve from back-breaking labor and the shadow of illness that lingered always near. By midday, the small wooden church was alive with sound. The bride, dressed in a gown sewn over weeks by her mother and sisters, moved quietly among the preparations. Her face was pale but serene, her eyes lowered in the way expected of a young woman stepping into her new role. Some recalled later that she smiled only faintly, that her laughter once bright in childhood was strangely absent. But no one gave this much thought at the time. Weddings were moments of order, not of doubt. The ceremony itself unfolded as many did, hymns sung in voices trembling with emotion, vows spoken before family, neighbors, and pastor, the exchange of rings modest but sincere. The groom, a farmer's son, stood tall and proud, his hand firm as he guided his bride from the altar. Applause and cries of blessing filled the room, followed by the rustle of skirts and boots as the congregation poured out into the sunlight. A feast awaited them, tables set with roasted meats, pies, bread, and sweet cider. Music struck up, fiddles and banjos joining in rustic harmony as laughter rang across the clearing. Yet as evening fell, the celebration took on a different mood. The light dimmed, and with it came a heaviness, though few would admit it aloud. Weddings carried their own superstitions, and many families whispered old warnings. A bride must never trip on her gown as she left the church, lest her marriage be cursed. A wedding ring dropped was an omen of death, and if a candle blew out during the feast, it foretold misfortune. That day, some claimed a candle had indeed sputtered and died, though others swore it was only the wind. When the dancing was done and the guests began to depart, the bride was escorted to the house where she and her new husband would spend their first night. It was a modest structure built of timber standing near the edge of the woods. A fire glowed in the hearth, casting shadows across the walls. She stepped across the threshold, and those who walked with her remembered nothing unusual, only a quiet young woman, weary from the day, retreating at last to privacy. That was the last time anyone saw her. The alarm came with the dawn. The groom, pale and frantic, stumbled from the house, calling for help. He said his wife was gone. She had retired with him, he claimed, laid her head down upon the bed, and when he awoke, she was not there. No door had been opened, no window forced. Her gown lay folded neatly on a chair, her shoes by the bedside. But she was gone, as if the night itself had taken her. Neighbors rushed to search the surrounding woods. They called her name, their voices swallowed by the dense pines. Men carried lanterns into the swampy lowlands, wading through mud, listening for the sound of a cry. Women walked the roads, scanning ditches and fields. But there was nothing. No torn fabric, no trail of footprints, no sign of struggle. It was as though she had vanished into air. Whispers spread quickly. Some suggested she had fled the marriage, perhaps in fear or reluctance. But where could she have gone barefoot, in the dark, with no provisions? Others muttered about spirits, pointing toward the nearby swamp, said to be haunted by the restless dead of old battles. A few turned suspicion upon the groom himself. Had he quarreled with her? Had some violence taken place behind closed doors? But even as the question arose, there was no evidence, no blood, no marks, no sound in the night. Days passed. The searches grew desperate. A party of men rode miles along the riverbanks, probing thickets and dragging shallow waters. Dogs were brought, their noses pressed to the fabric of her dress. Yet even they gave no clear trail, circling and whimpering as though confused. Women of the settlement gathered in prayer, their voices breaking as they begged for revelation. The groom became an object of both pity and suspicion. Some described him as inconsolable, his eyes hollow, his words incoherent. Others noted his silence, his refusal to answer certain questions, his reluctance to join the searches. The tension grew sharper when rumors emerged. A witness claimed to have seen him alone in the woods days before, digging. But when pressed, no one could find such a place, and the rumor faded into the haze of gossip that always followed misfortune. Weeks later, the story had spread beyond the settlement. Travelers carried it to neighboring towns, where it was retold with variations. In some, the bride had been taken by bandits. In others, she had been stolen by the creek spirits of the forest. In still others, she had been buried beneath the house itself. Each retelling darkened the mystery, turning absence into legend. For the families, grief curdled into silence. The bride's parents retreated from public life, their cabin often closed, their presence at church rare. The groom's family defended him fiercely, but the shadow remained. Every glance, every whisper in the marketplace seemed to circle back to the night of the vanishing. Years later, when newcomers asked about the tale, the elders spoke cautiously. Some claimed her body had been found in a hollow tree, though no proof was ever offered. Others said she appeared in dreams, standing at the edge of the woods, her face pale and veiled, beckoning silently. Still others believed she had been taken not by man or spirit, but by the land itself, absorbed into the swamp like so many before her. The truth, if it existed, never came to light. And so the bride of 1822 remained both person and phantom, her fate suspended between history and myth. In the weeks that followed the disappearance, the settlement moved in a haze of disbelief. Weddings were meant to seal harmony between families and affirm community bonds. Instead, this one had become a wound no one could close. The bride's absence hung in the air like smoke, drifting into every household, shaping every conversation whispered in the fields and at the hearths. At first, neighbors clung to hope. They spoke of accidents, of confusion, of some misstep that might still be explained. Perhaps she had lost her way in the dark and would emerge, weary but alive, from the woods. Perhaps she had gone to relatives in secret. Even the pastor from his pulpit urged restraint. "The Lord sees what we cannot," he told his congregation. Patience and prayer will reveal what is hidden, but hope decayed quickly. Days passed into weeks and no sign appeared. Farmers returning from the fields brought tidings not of crops but of fruitless searches. Hunters swore they scoured the forest floor as carefully as they scanned the treetops, yet nothing stirred. When silence persisted, the human heart did what it so often does. It filled the void with speculation. Rumors flourished like weeds. Some said the groom was guilty, that he had quarreled with his new wife, his pride stung, his temper uncontrollable. Others claimed the bride herself had harbored secrets another lover, perhaps, or fears she had kept hidden until the very hour of her vows. Still others whispered of darker forces. "The swamp took her," muttered the old women, their eyes fixed on the ground. The spirits don't let go once they've chosen. The bride's family bore the brunt of grief. Her mother fell into silence, speaking little, her hands idle in her lap where once they had worked endlessly at sewing or kneading bread. Her father, once a steady figure, began to drink heavily, his anger spilling over in bursts of bitterness against neighbors who dared mention the disappearance. Her siblings, young and bewildered, asked questions that went unanswered, their childhood colored forever by the shadow of a sister who vanished. The groom, meanwhile, lived in the uneasy space between sympathy and suspicion. Some neighbors swore he wandered sleepless, his clothes disheveled, his face drawn. They believed his grief genuine. Others noted his refusal to speak at length, his sharp words when pressed, his absence from Sunday services. The pastor himself visited the young man, but returned with little more than sighs. His sorrow is great, he admitted, but there is a heaviness I cannot read. The newspapers in nearby towns caught wind of the story. Columns appeared beneath bold headings: "Bride missing on wedding night," and "Mysterious disappearance in rural Alabama." Each retelling exaggerated the strangeness, casting the settlement as a stage for tragedy. Some writers framed it as a cautionary tale about young love. Others hinted at scandal or crime. For a community unaccustomed to outside eyes, this attention was deeply unsettling. Families felt exposed, their grief turned into spectacle. Superstition added another layer of unease. Dreams became a kind of currency. Women told of seeing the bride in visions, standing in a clearing with her hands outstretched, or drifting silently through the pews of the church. Children claimed to hear her laughter in the wind at night. These tales spread not as entertainment but as warnings. Doors were bolted earlier. Candles were kept burning long after they might have been snuffed. No one wanted to be alone after dusk. Doctors, though fewer in number, weighed in with their own explanations. One suggested the bride might have suffered a fit, what some called brain fever, and wandered into the forest disoriented. Another speculated about sleepwalking, though such cases were poorly understood and often dismissed as superstition themselves. Yet these rational accounts did little to ease fear. Science in its infancy here offered no body, no closure. The pastor's sermons shifted tone. No longer urging patience, he began to speak of sin and hidden deeds. "What is concealed shall be revealed," he thundered, quoting scripture. To many, it sounded less like comfort and more like accusation. People left the services shaken, their eyes darting toward the groom, the bride's family, and even one another. Suspicion had become a contagion, spreading silently from home to home. Years later, elders would recall how deeply the event changed the settlement. For months after, weddings were rare, as though the community feared repeating the curse. Parents warned daughters to avoid the swamp at dusk. Children dared one another to stand near the house where the bride had last been seen, its timbers weathered by seasons, but its silence louder than any scream. The story seeped into folklore. By winter, travelers passing through heard not just of a vanished bride, but of a ghostly woman seen drifting along the riverbank, her gown trailing in the water. Some claimed she could be heard knocking on cabin doors, asking in a hollow voice for a lantern to guide her way. These were not merely stories told for thrill, they were survival narratives, warnings disguised as entertainment. They spoke to the unease of a people who lived daily with uncertainty, with the knowledge that life could be cut short without reason. Even as years turned to decades, the community remained marked. Families who had lived through the event carried it like an unspoken inheritance. Children of that generation grew up under its shadow, reminded constantly of how quickly joy could turn to dread. The bride's name, rarely spoken aloud, lingered as a symbol of fragility. Her absence became more than a mystery. It became a mirror in which the settlement saw its own fears reflected. In the end, society did what it always does when faced with an enigma it cannot solve. It folded the disappearance into its identity, balancing skepticism and belief, rational explanations and whispered legends. For the bride's family, the reaction of the community was salt in a wound. For the groom, it was a prison from which he never escaped. For everyone else, it was a story half history, half haunting that shaped how they viewed life, death, and the unknown. The turning point came not with discovery, but with something far stranger, a series of moments that blurred the line between reality and the spectral, leaving the community more unsettled than ever before. By the late autumn of 1822, the disappearance had become a wound that would not heal. Families tried to return to routine, yet the absence of the bride weighed like a stone upon their daily lives. Then came the first sighting. A farmer, returning late from tending his livestock, swore he saw a figure gliding near the churchyard. It was dusk, the last light clinging to the horizon, and he described the vision with trembling detail. A woman in pale garments, her veil trailing behind her, moving soundlessly among the gravestones. At first he believed it a neighbor, some relative come to pray, but when he called out, the figure did not turn. Instead, it drifted across the yard and vanished into the trees as though the earth itself had swallowed her. The man, not one given to fancy, was so shaken he refused to walk that road again at night. Soon, others began to report their own encounters. Women drawing water from the well heard faint sobbing carried on the wind. Children swore they saw a pale hand pressed against the glass of the church window, even when no one was inside. The most chilling account came from the groom himself. One evening, he claimed, he awoke to find her standing at the foot of his bed, her face half shrouded by the veil, her eyes dark pools that seemed both empty and filled with accusation. Before he could speak, she was gone, leaving the room colder than a winter morning. The community was torn. Some believed these visions were divine signs, proof that the bride lingered in some half-state waiting for justice. Others whispered that the settlement was cursed, that a bargain had been broken long before the wedding, and that her disappearance was payment. The pastor, now a gaunt man with restless eyes, declared from the pulpit that the bride's spirit would not rest until sin was confessed. His sermons grew more fiery, more accusatory, and the congregation trembled beneath his words. This spiritual unease soon took physical form. A search was organized once more, lanterns blazing in the night, men armed with rifles and axes scouring the woods and swamps. They marched in silence, the air thick with fear. In the reeds near the riverbank, one of the dogs howled a long, mournful cry that froze every man in his tracks. When they rushed to the spot, they found scraps of fabric tangled in the brush. White silk, soaked in mud, frayed at the edges as though torn by violent hands. To some, it was proof at last. To others, it was only another cruel mystery. Evidence without a body, a fragment without resolution. The discovery ignited frenzy. Women clutched their children tighter, afraid to let them wander. Men sharpened their tools, convinced that whoever or whatever had taken the bride still lurked among them. Theories spiraled into accusations. The groom's house was nearly burned by neighbors who muttered that guilt hung over him like a shroud. The bride's family, already undone by grief, fell further into despair, their home marked with rumors of curses and hidden sins. And then came the night of the storm. Lightning split the sky, rain falling in sheets that turned roads to rivers. Families huddled by their fires, praying aloud as thunder shook the earth. Amid the tempest, a sound rose above the storm, a keening wail, high and unearthly, carrying across the fields. Those who heard it described it as both human and not, a cry of anguish that pierced bone and marrow. Some swore it was the bride herself, her voice echoing through the storm, demanding to be found. Others insisted it was the devil's mockery, a trick meant to unhinge their minds. The pastor, driven to desperation, gathered the congregation in the church the following day. He urged confession, demanded repentance, his voice raw with fervor. "This is not the work of men," he declared, his hand slamming against the pulpit. "This is judgment," some wept openly, falling to their knees. Others clenched their jaws, refusing to believe that their fates were tied to a vanished girl. But belief, once seated, cannot easily be uprooted. The church itself became the stage of the climax. Late one night, as rain pattered against the roof, the groom returned there alone. Neighbors claimed they saw him walking with a lantern, his figure small against the shadows. He did not emerge until morning, his face ashen, his eyes hollow. When pressed, he said little, only muttering that he had heard her voice in the sanctuary, calling his name, whispering words he dared not repeat. He would never step foot in the church again. For the settlement, this marked the breaking point. The line between superstition and lived reality dissolved. Every creak of timber, every cry of the wind became a reminder that the bride had not left them, that her absence had become a presence, one that consumed their waking lives. People fled the area in small numbers, abandoning farms, unwilling to live under the shadow of the legend. Others stayed but carried a look of constant unease, as if the forest itself now watched them. The climax was not a single moment of revelation, but a series of terrors that closed in like a tightening noose. The fabric found by the river, the wails in the storm, the sightings that grew more frequent, more vivid, until even the skeptical admitted to feeling her near. The community, once bound together in celebration, had unraveled into suspicion, fear, and silence. The bride had vanished, but in her absence, she had become more powerful than she ever was in life. A symbol of dread, a figure haunting both memory and land. By the close of that year, no answers had been found, but no one believed the story was finished. The bride's presence lingered not only in whispers but in the very air, a constant reminder that some mysteries resist burial. The climax of her tale was not the night she disappeared, it was the way her absence consumed the living, turning their joy into ash, their faith into fear, their silence into a kind of worship of the unknown. Time passed, yet the absence never loosened its grip. By the winter of 1823, the settlement in Alabama had shifted, reshaped by a single vanishing. Families who once built their lives on certainty now carried unease as naturally as breath. The bride's disappearance had ceased to be merely a personal tragedy. It had become a kind of folklore, a story told in whispers that carried the weight of both warning and lament. Her family lived in a state of half-existence, unable to mourn properly without a body, unable to hope without proof of life. The groom himself withdrew into silence, a man hollowed out, his youthful features replaced by a gaunt shadow of who he had been. When he spoke, it was often of dreams, dreams in which she called to him, not with malice, but with a strange, sorrowful longing, as though trapped between worlds. The community grew divided in their interpretations. Some insisted that she had been taken by foul play, her body hidden somewhere in the dense woodlands or murky swamps, the crime forever concealed by the landscape. Others leaned toward the supernatural. They whispered that her spirit had been claimed, that her vanishing was not a crime but a crossing, a ritual of some forgotten kind. The church sermons gave no peace, for the pastor himself appeared tormented, unable to decide whether her fate was divine punishment or an earthly crime. As the years lengthened, the story adapted. Children who had not even been born on the night of the vanished bride grew up hearing her tale by firelight. They were warned not to stray near the riverbank after dusk, lest they hear her wail on the wind. Lovers were told to tread carefully in their vows, for unkept promises might draw her spirit near. In this way, the missing bride became more than a person. She became a symbol woven into the cultural fabric of rural Alabama. Scholars much later would analyze the story, searching for threads of truth. Some argued she was likely a victim of violence, her body concealed by someone close to her, her ghostly legacy born from grief and guilt. Others examined the psychology of the time, noting how communities under hardship often created legends to explain what they could not face directly. The vanished bride was, to them, an outlet for unspoken fears of instability, mortality, and betrayal. A few even suggested natural explanations: the storm, the river, the wildlife of the swamps. In such an unforgiving environment, a single misstep could erase a person without a trace. But none of these explanations settled the matter, because folklore thrives not on certainty, but on possibility. The bride's story lingered precisely because it was unfinished. Her absence was a question that time refused to answer, and in that unanswered space, generations projected their own fears. Even now, nearly 2 centuries later, the tale of the bride who vanished on her wedding night remains alive in local legend. Travelers speak of lonely stretches of road where a woman in a tattered veil appears in flashes of lightning, or of a churchyard where a pale figure stands, only to dissolve into mist. Residents, when asked, often smile thinly and say little, as though acknowledging her name might invite her presence. Perhaps the most haunting aspect is not whether she truly vanished into violence or into legend, but how thoroughly her absence shaped the living. Families left, fields went untended, and an entire community bent beneath the shadow of a single night. History remembers wars, treaties, and leaders, but in quiet corners of the South, it also remembers a missing bride because to those who lived it, her absence was as real and devastating as any great event. And so, the epilogue remains unresolved. Was she the victim of betrayal, her trust shattered on the very night it was meant to be sealed forever? Or was she a figure claimed by something larger than human malice, by fate, by myth, by forces unnamed? The truth hides, as it always has, somewhere between silence and speculation. We are left with the image of her, forever poised on the edge of memory. A bride in white, walking into the night, swallowed by shadows and never returning. Some say she became a ghost. Others say she never left the hearts of those who lost her. Perhaps both are true. The story does not end because it cannot. Instead, it lingers, like the toll of a distant bell carried on the air long after the sound has ceased. A reminder that sometimes the most enduring presence is absence itself.